Let's take a look at social structure. And when we talk about social structure, we are talking about kind of a network of interrelated statuses and roles that tend to guide human behavior and human interaction. So when we talk about the statuses and roles, let's take a look real quick at those components. Okay? First of all, when we talk about status, it's a socially defined position within a group or a society. So where you stand, kind of like in the previous picture. Let's go back real quick, and in that picture you can tell, that's based on where people line themselves up, how valued they are. That's what we're really looking at when we talk about status. Now, with status, a lot of times we talk about achieved or ascribed status. Let's talk about ascribed status first. Ascribed status is basically assigned to an individual with no regard for their ability or accomplishments. They didn't have to do anything to get that status. For example, your age. You cannot do anything about your age. You're going to get older, or you're going to cease to exist, one of the two. So, you can want to be 21, all you want, but until you're actually there, you're not, it's not going to do any good. Your sex, unless you go extreme, you're, whatever you were born at, that's what you're going to be. Your place of birth, I'm going to be a Hoosier forever. I can't do anything to change that. Okay? Now, achieved status, that's a little different because that's requiring certain abilities or qualities. You've done something to earn it. So, for example, your education, right now you're trying to achieve a college degree and get that achieved status. So, your income, your occupation, your marital status, all of that would be achieved. Okay? Now, the other thing we look at here are roles. And basically, roles are learned behaviors that are considered appropriate for a particular situation or for a particular status even. Roles do tend to standardize behavior, which can lead to norms eventually. Within roles, we talk about the number of roles that you play. If you took all the roles that you play on a day-to-day basis and add them all up, we'd talk about your role complex. That would be everything. So you might be a male, you might be a son, you might be a student, a husband, a father, a coach, a friend. Those are all roles that you may play, and that makes up your role complex. Okay? Now, some roles can create conflict. For example, if you have two or more of your roles that call for opposite actions. Let's say that you're a parent and you've got a job, and all of a sudden one day your child is sick. Well, if you're going to be a good employee, that means you go to work, you get your job done, you take care of business. If you're going to be a good parent, that role says you should stay home and take care of your child. So that creates a conflict that then people have to deal with, and that causes stress a lot of times. The other thing we can talk about is role strain. Now, role strain is when you have one role, but it basically imposes conflicting demands and expectations. So, for example, a parent wants to show love and concern for their child, but yet they also have to discipline their child. So, that creates some strain on the relationship sometimes, and that role is something that people have issues with occasionally. Now, these statuses and roles change as societies become more complex. And that's what we're going to take a look at real quick, is kind of the evolution of various societies. Sociologist Gerhard Linsky years ago came up with what he called the sociocultural evolution model. And what this meant is he was looking at societies, and he believed that societies naturally evolve. He classified them into categories according to their subsistence strategy. The subsistence strategy is basically the way that the society uses technology to satisfy their needs. So, if we take a look, the most basic type of society would be what we call, or what he called, a pre-industrial society. Food is the major economic activity. It's usually done with human or animal labor. Production tends to be very slow, tends to be limited. There's normally a very strong bond within the family unit. A pre-industrial society could be all the way back to when we lived in hunting and gathering societies, which were normally 60 people or less, or it could be, a horticultural society, a vegetable gardening type society, where villages developed around gardens. Now that could increase the size of the society up to a couple thousand people. Allowed for more detail in terms of the economy, the government, and so on. Or we could be talking about an agricultural society where animals and plows were used for labor to grow crops. The more crops you had, it enabled the society to support more people. And literally, you're talking millions of people at this point. Most people worked the crops, but a large percentage also had specialized roles where they did other things. So you had the development of cities, you had increased trading, which led to a monetary system. And as soon as you talk about a monetary system, you're going to talk about a big difference in status that develops between landowners and laborers and people of that nature. So that's what we talk about the pre-industrial society. Pre-industrial societies were prevalent, at least in America, prior to about 1760, that time period. And then we move in the late 1800s or late 1700s and early 1800s, we move into the industrial age, the industrial society. And this was the mechanized production of goods. That was the major economic activity. Labor was done by machines. Industrialization obviously increased the amount of food, which increases again the number of people that society could support. The percentage of people needed for agriculture was reduced. Therefore, a lot of people were free to produce goods. And the center of focus now became the factories. It wasn't necessarily the family as cities developed around the country. Workers were now responsible for not only one part of the finished product, or rather they were responsible for only one part of like a finished product on an assembly line due to efficiency. So education also kind of moved out of the family unit. Most of the status now started to be achieved status. Now, this carried into the middle 1800s, and from that point on, the late 1800s, early 1900s, we really became what's called a post-industrial society, according to Linsky. And in a post-industrial, the production of information and the providing of services was the major economic activity. In the United States today, over 75% of the workforce is involved in providing information and or services. There's literally only about 2% of our population is employed in agriculture or the production of food, and that leaves a little over 20% that are employed in the production of goods. So science and technology increase the quality of life, and the standard of living tends to get higher. As we advance in that regard, the emphasis now becomes even more important on education and career advancement. Science became a big deal at this point in time. And then the last type, now Linsky kind of ended it there, but from that point on, other sociologists believe that, from essentially the latter half of the 1970s maybe and on, so the 1980s, 90s, and so on, we've kind of gone into what they call a postmodern society. And a postmodern society is where basically we're so technologically advanced and we're preoccupied with consumer goods, media images, and things like that on a global scale. Goods and images represent the influences of many cultures. And so there's a lot of merging, there's a lot of cultural diffusion, which in many ways can lead to new patterns of communication and even new types of social structure. So all of that, as society continues to develop, we just become more and more complex, which leads to a greater difference between the roles and the statuses that influence human behavior. Now, another way to look at social structure on a societal scale would be to try and figure out, for example, what holds society together. And there are two guys that we kind of look to. Both of these evaluated culture back, or these societies basically, back in the late 1800s. But the first one, Ferdinand Ternier's. It looks like Tannies, but it's actually Ternier's. Ferdinand Ternier's, basically, he studied the two types of societies, and anytime you talk about a type, an ideal type of society, you're going to be talking about Ternier's. Now, he referred to the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft is a German word meaning community. It refers to a society in which most of the members know one another, relationships are close, families are the center of activity, strong sense of group solidarity. And that solidarity arises from a collective sense of loyalty to the whole society. So it's that loyalty that tends to hold that group together. Okay? A Gesellschaft, on the other hand, is the German word meaning society, and it refers to a society in which the relationships are more impersonal and temporary. There's less personal ties, there's a lessened sense of loyalty to the total society. So traditional values tend to be weaker, individual goals tend to be more important than group goals. Now, he believes there's still cohesion, there's still togetherness, but it comes more from a division of labor in that society. In other words, we need each other because of those labor differences. So that's what we talk about in terms of Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft. Now, how do you remember those terms? Well, I'm not the greatest at mnemonic devices, but one of my former students actually came up with this, and I always mess up her name, but Gazelle Bunche, I don't know, however it's pronounced. Tom Brady's wife is who we're looking at or talking about there. But they said that they always remembered a Gesellschaft because her name sounds like Gesellschaft, and she probably lives in a city. So if that helps you to remember it, great. The other person that we're going to talk about real quick is Durkheim. And Durkheim focused more on the relationships that he found within the societies. And he said that it was this collective consciousness that gives groups that solidarity. In other words, they feel like they're part of a particular society. He referred to mechanical solidarity, which was close-knit social relationships. People had the same values, they did the same things, they felt bonded to each other because everybody's so similar. Now, he found those in pre-industrial societies. And then he also talked about organic solidarity, and that was impersonal relationships that arise, again, with job specialization. Those relationships were based more, again, on our need rather than on shared values. The division of labor caused us to need one another. I can't grow my own, well, I could grow some food, but I can't, like if I want meat or a steak, I can't do that myself. I need other people to take care of those things for me. So you've got Ternier's and Durkheim, and basically talking about how society is held together.